What if I told you that one of the most beloved faces in the history of the American Western, a man who traded lines with Clint Eastwood and shared the screen with Dustin Hoffman, spent the first 60 years of his life without ever once stepping in front of a camera? For 6 decades, he was a nobody, a longshoreman, a logger, a man who broke his body on the docks of Vancouver and drove a school bus to feed his children. The world walked past him without a second look. And then, in his 70s, at an age when most men are handed a gold watch and forgotten, he did something no one from his people had ever done before. He walked into Hollywood, and Hollywood stood up. His name was Chief Dan George. And when he was 5 years old, the government took his language away from him. They took his name. They told a small boy that everything he was wrong. He waited 66 years to answer them. And when he finally did, he didn't do it with anger. He did it with something far more powerful. He did it with dignity. There is a line he made famous, a prayer he spoke lying down in the dirt, dressed for his own death. "My heart soars like a hawk." Remember that line, because by the time we reach the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly what it cost him to say it, and exactly why it made a nation weep. This is the story of a man who was told to disappear, and refused. Let's begin. Number 1. The boy whose name was taken. He was born on the 24th of July, 1899, on Burrard Reserve number 3, on the north shore of the water near Vancouver. His people called him Geswanouth Slahoot. His father was a chief. His world was the inlet, the forest, and the old language that had been spoken on that land for thousands of years. And then, just after his 5th birthday, they came for him. In 1904, they sent the boy to St. Paul's Mission School, and the first thing the school did was erase him. They told him his name was no longer Geswanouth Slahoot. From now on, he would be called George, after his father's English name, a 5-year-old, stripped of the only name he had ever known. And it got worse. Inside those walls, the children were forbidden to speak their own language, forbidden to practice the beliefs of their grandfathers. A small boy, punished for the sound of the words his mother had taught him. Every 2 weeks, he would catch the streetcar to the end of the line and then walk 7 miles through the dark to get home for a Friday night. 7 miles. To remember who he was. His son said it plainly, years later. The effect on his father was devastating. It never left him. Now hold on to that image. A child, taught that his own voice was something to be ashamed of. Because one day, that same voice would stop a stadium of 32,000 people cold. But how does a boy who was told to be silent become the man who speaks for an entire people? Number 2. 27 years on the docks. When he left the mission school around the age of 17, there was no red carpet waiting. There was work. Hard, brutal, body-breaking work. He went straight into the forest and cut trees for 3 years. And then, in 1923, his father-in-law pulled a string and got him one of the most coveted jobs a man could have on the waterfront. He became a longshoreman on the docks of Vancouver. And he stayed there. Not for a year, not for 5. He worked those docks, off and on, for 27 years. Think about what those years contained. The great strikes of the 1920s. The Depression of the 1930s, when the work dried up, and he fed his family by hunting and cutting lumber. He married a Squamish woman named Amy when he was barely more than a boy himself, and together they would raise their children through all of it. This was a man who knew what it was to be invisible, to lift and haul and sweat, while the world looked straight through him. No fame, no applause, just the weight of the load, and the pride of a man who never once complained about carrying it. For most people, that would be the entire story. A working man, a family man, and then the quiet fade into old age. And for the first 50 years of his life, that's exactly what everyone expected of Dan George. So what happens to a man who has given his entire body to a job on the day that job finally breaks him? Number 3. The load that nearly killed him. The year was 1947. Dan George was 48 years old, and he was doing what he had always done, working the lumber on the Vancouver waterfront. And then a swing load of timber swung the wrong way. He described it himself, in words no screenwriter could improve. No bones were broken, he said. but my leg and hip muscles were smashed to hamburger. Smashed to hamburger. That was the end of the docks. That was the end of the strongest chapter of his working life. A man who had built his entire identity on the strength of his own body, watched that body fail him in a single, violent instant. Most men would have called that the beginning of the end. He was pushing 50, half-crippled, with a family to feed and no fortune to show for a lifetime of labor. He picked himself up and found what work he could. Construction, crane work, and eventually driving a school bus full of children through the streets of North Vancouver. Picture that for a moment. The future Academy Award nominee behind the wheel of a school bus. None of the children on that bus had the faintest idea who they were riding with. Neither did he. But here is what that accident really did. By taking away his body, it cleared the way for the world to finally hear his voice. Because a man who can no longer haul lumber has to find another way to be strong. And what came next would surprise everyone, starting with Dan George himself. Number 4. The chief of his people. In 1951, the weight of leadership came to him. His father had been chief of the Burrard Band, the people we now know as the Tsleil-Waututh. And when the time came, that responsibility passed to Dan George. For 12 years, he led his people. Not from a Hollywood mansion, not from a place of power and comfort. He led them the way his father had, and his father before him, from within the community, carrying its burdens on his own back. And this is the part that matters. Everything you are about to see him do on a movie screen, every wise elder, every dignified chief, every man of quiet authority, he did not have to act any of it. He had lived it. He said it himself, with a twinkle in his eye. "I was an Indian chief for 12 years, he told a reporter, so I really didn't have to do much acting. Only a man completely at peace with himself could say something that humble about a talent that would soon astonish the world." By 1963, his time as chief was ending. He was 63 years old. His body was worn. His working life, by every reasonable measure, was over. In the ordinary telling of a man's life, this is the final chapter. Except Dan George's story was about to do something almost no other life ever does. It was about to start over. So what pulls a 60-year-old chief off a school bus and drops him onto a television set? Number 5. The accidental actor. It happened by pure chance. The kind of accident that changes everything. The national broadcaster was making a television series called Caribou Country. There was a role in it, an aging Indian elder named Ol Antoine. And the actor cast in that part fell seriously ill. They needed a replacement, and they needed one within a week. Someone suggested the old chief who drove the school bus. Dan George, around 60 years old, with no training, no experience, and no ambition to be an actor, was asked to audition. He got the part. And then something remarkable happened. This untrained laborer, this man who had never studied a single day of acting in his life, turned out to be one of the finest natural performers anyone had ever seen. One critic said he played the role to ultimate perfection. The stage came calling too. A playwright named George Riga was so struck by this man that he rewrote an entire play around him, The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. He said it plainly. The character of the father in that play was Dan George. The role and the man had become the same thing. Here was a truth the world was slowly waking up to. Everything the mission school had tried to beat out of that 5-year-old boy, his heritage, his voice, his very way of being, turned out to be the exact thing that made him unforgettable. But acting in a local television show is one thing. Standing in front of 32,000 people and daring to tell them the truth, that is something else entirely. And that day was coming fast. Number 6. The day he silenced a stadium. The date was the 1st of July, 1967, Canada's 100th birthday, a day the entire country expected to spend celebrating. They gathered 32,000 people into Empire Stadium in Vancouver, and they invited the dignified old chief to say a few words. They expected something gentle, something grateful, a nice ceremonial blessing to make everyone feel good about 100 years of history. That is not what they got. Dan George rose, and he began to speak. He called it a lament for Confederation, And what came out of the mouth of that soft-spoken man cut through the celebration like a blade. "When I fought to protect my land and my home," he told them, "I was called a savage. When I neither understood nor welcomed his way of life, I was called lazy. The white man's strange customs, which I could not understand, pressed down upon me until I could no longer breathe." 1 quote. The stadium went silent. 32,000 people, expecting a party, sat frozen as an old man told them the truth about what the last 100 years had cost his people. But here is the genius of the man. He did not end in bitterness. He ended in fire. "Like the thunderbird of old," he said, "I shall rise again out of the sea. I shall grab the instruments of the white man's success, his education, his skills, and with these new tools, I shall build my race into the proudest segment of your society." And then the silence broke, and they rose to their feet. That 5-year-old boy who had been forbidden to speak had just spoken for an entire nation of the forgotten. Remember what he asked for in that speech: the tools of success. Because within 3 years, he was about to pick up the most powerful tool of all. But would Hollywood, a place that had spent 50 years turning his people into cartoons, actually let him use it? Number 7. The role 3 legends turned down. In 1970, a director named Arthur Penn was making a film called Little Big Man. It starred Dustin Hoffman, the hottest young actor in the world. And at the heart of it was a character called Old Lodge Skins, a wise, funny, deeply human Cheyenne elder who adopts a lost white boy as his own. Here is the astonishing part. Before Dan George was ever considered, that role was offered to some of the greatest names in the business: Marlon Brando, Laurence Olivier, Paul Scofield, 3 of the most celebrated actors alive, and one by one they said no. The part came to the old chief instead, and what he did with it would rewrite the rules. For 50 years, Hollywood had shown Native people as one thing only: the faceless savage on the far side of the hill, there to be shot off a horse. Dan George walked onto that screen and demolished that lie. His Old Lodge Skins was warm. He was wise. He was hilarious. He teased. He grieved. He loved. He was, for the first time in the memory of the American movie audience, a full human being. He said the makeup took 4 or 5 hours a day to age him for the part. He said he modeled the character on his own great-grand-uncle, a man who had lived to be 110 and had told him stories of the world before the white man came. He was not inventing this dignity. He was remembering it. And there was one scene in that film, one single scene, that would carry his name across the world. So what does a man who has spent his whole life being told to lie down and disappear do when the script finally asks him to face death on his own terms? Number 8. Sometimes the magic works. The scene is simple. Old Lodge Skins decides it is his time. He dresses in his finest regalia. He climbs to a high place. He offers a prayer to the sky, and then he lies down in the open air to die with dignity. "Thank you for making me a human being," he prays. "Thank you for helping me to become a warrior." And then he closes his eyes and waits for death to take him. But death does not come. Instead, it begins to rain. A few drops fall on the old man's face. His eyes open. He blinks up at the gray sky, and with the greatest comic timing in the history of the Western, he sits up and says, "Well, sometimes the magic works, sometimes it doesn't." Audiences roared. And then they wept. Because in 10 seconds, this untrained old longshoreman had shown them the whole of the human condition, our courage in the face of death, and the beautiful absurdity of a world that doesn't always cooperate. Dan George insisted that moment was his creation. "That was my own song," he said, "my own dance, and my own way of talking to the great white spirit. Those things were all my idea." An untrained actor, in his 70s, was quietly out-inventing the finest professionals in Hollywood. The critics saw it instantly. One wrote, "This one Indian will not vanish from your memory." Roger Ebert praised the serenity and conviction he brought to the role. And that praise was about to turn into something that had never happened before in the history of the Academy Awards. But triumph, for Dan George, would arrive holding hands with the deepest sorrow of his life. Number 9. the Oscar, and the empty chair. When the nominations were announced, Dan George's name was on the list for Best Supporting Actor, and with that single line on a page, history turned. He became the first Indigenous North American actor ever nominated for an Acting Academy Award. A man born on a reserve in 1899, told at the age of 5 that everything he was had no value, was now, at 71 years old, standing among the most honored performers on earth. He didn't win the statue that April night in 1971. It went to John Mills. But make no mistake, Dan George won everything that mattered. The New York Film Critics Circle named him Best Supporting Actor. So did the National Society of Film Critics. The professionals, the ones who really understood the craft, knew exactly what they had just witnessed. And he understood what it meant beyond himself. "I don't want the Indians called second-class people anymore," he said. He had set a goal when he became an actor, to do something that would give a name and a face and a soul to his people. And he had done it. But listen closely, because this is where the story breaks your heart. That same year, as her husband prepared to travel to Hollywood for the honor of his life, his wife Amy died, his partner of more than 50 years, the Squamish girl he had married when they were both barely grown, gone. He had climbed higher than any man of his people ever had, and the one person he most wanted beside him at the top was no longer there. His son would say, years later, that his father never truly recovered, that in the end, he died of a broken heart. The boy, forbidden to speak, had spoken to the whole world, but the world had taken something from him in return. So how does a man carry that kind of grief and still give us one of the most beloved performances in Western history? Number 10. Endeavor to Persevere. In 1976, Clint Eastwood was directing and starring in The Outlaw Josey Wales, and he needed someone to play Lone Watie, an old Cherokee man who becomes Josey's traveling companion, his conscience, and his friend. He gave the part to Dan George, and the two of them created something the audience has never forgotten. There is a monologue in that film that fans quote to this day. Lone Watie remembers being taken to Washington, dressed up, and paraded before the Secretary of the Interior. "They gave us medals for looking so civilized," he says. The officials shook their hands and told them to endeavor to persevere. And so, Lone Watie says, after they had thought about those grand words long enough, "We declared war on the Union." It is funny. It is devastating. It is Dan George telling the truth about his people, one more time, wrapped inside a Clint Eastwood Western that millions of Americans loved. Eastwood adored working with him. He said the old man had no formal training, but what a storyteller. Eastwood would start the camera rolling without telling him, just to catch the magic of a man who half remembered his lines and improvised the rest into something better than any writer could have penned. And then, on the 23rd of September, 1981, at the age of 82, Chief Dan George died in a Vancouver hospital. Around 1,200 people filled the cathedral for his funeral. And as they carried him out, the rain came down. The same rain that had opened Old Lodge Skin's eyes on that mountainside, falling now on the man who had shown the world how to meet death with a smile. Remember the prayer from the very start of our story? "My heart soars like a hawk." It wasn't just a movie line. It was the title of his own book of poetry. It was how a man who was told to disappear at the age of 5 chose to describe his own soul. The beauty of the trees, the softness of the air, the fragrance of the grass, and my heart, he wrote, soars. They took his name. They took his language. They told a small boy to be silent, and he answered them with a life so full of grace that a whole continent finally learned to listen, not with anger, not with bitterness, with dignity, to the very last breath. If this story moved you the way it moved me, do one thing for the old chief. Leave his name in the comments below so the algorithm carries his memory to someone who has never heard it. Because a man like Chief Dan George was never supposed to be forgotten, and thank you for watching.